presentation you've ever seen, even from me. I'm interested, I'm not terribly interested in colors, personally. I'm interested in a general question that the metaphysics of color exemplifies. And lots of really, really clever philosophers with way too much time on their hands have really been invested in the metaphysics of color. So the dialectical situation that goes on in discussion of the metaphysics of color, just transpose those into a new key, and it becomes, they can become discussions of the metaphysics of other realms of reality. Metaphysics philosophy in general has to begin somewhere. That is, it has to begin with pre-analytic data, with some sort of innocent, naive view of the world. And it has to take something as requiring explanation. Even, when you think about it, suppose you are a solipsistic idealist. You've started the solipsist club and you're wondering why no one comes to your meetings. Even a solipsistic idealist needs an explanation for why what happens to be appearing to him is appearing to him, as opposed to something else is appearing to him. That is, metaphysicians got to take something to be real in order to discountenance other things. Colors have been a plausible candidate for discountenancing. The popular term here in philosophy is, of course, requining. Ever since Democritus and Leucippus in the 5th century BC. This received a boost in early modern philosophy with the growing assumption that only those features of the world which could be identified with, or at least somehow with lots and lots of arm waving and that hand gesture that philosophers use, explained by entities countenanced by the physical sciences, are real. Strong forms of this assumption, like Galileo's early naive view, are examples of Michael Stove's worst argument in the world, which I have listed on your handout. We can know things only as they are related to us under our forms of perception and understanding, insofar as they fall under our conceptual schemes, something like that. Therefore, we cannot know things as they are in themselves. And as Stove points out, this is like we can eat oysters only insofar as they are brought under the physiological and chemical conditions which are the presuppositions of the possibility of being eaten. Therefore, we cannot eat oysters as they are in themselves. Why Stove would want to eat oysters is anybody's guess, but apparently that's one of his depravities. I've also listed on your handout, I don't know how good this list is, but it's as complete a list as I can think of kind of who's who in the zoo with regard to very clever people wondering about the metaphysics of color on sort of all of the positions. And did everybody get a copy of this? Oh. Well, you won't have any fun at all if you don't. Okay. Of these, the first three can plausibly be considered physicalist accounts of color. Colors are real, and they are to be identified with microstructural properties of the surfaces of objects, capacities or dispositions to modify light, something like that. So physicalist properties of color are generally distinguished from dispositional theories of color. You'll notice that the first three make no essential reference to the appearance of colors, right? Only to physical properties. So on this account, colors would be in the world even if there were no color observers, as long as there were entities in the world that produced the right kind of physical responses. So I suppose, as long as there were, light detectors in the world, cameras in the world, then things would be red because they would produce the physical responses of that kind. Red would produce more responses in the higher spectrum than in the lower, et cetera, et cetera. The problems with color physicalism are equally well known. If colors are somehow micro properties of objects, if colors are micro properties of objects, then one of the difficulties is that lots of different micro properties in objects will produce judgments that will produce the same physiological responses under category 3. So then shade of red R1 shade of red R1 is either state M1 or state M2 or state M3, or something. Property, surface property M1 or M2 or M3, or now physicalists and all other sensible people rightly suspect an explanation that is so disjunctive. Anytime you run into a disjunctive explanation, you probably haven't gotten to the root of the matter. Shade of red R is M1 or M2 or M3 or some other property entirely. Remember, a reduction is an identity. We are saying that we can explain the properties by saying, by saying the properties of F's as G's, by saying that they really are G's. A physicalist theory that is this disjunctive just fails to get to the root of the matter. It fails to carve nature at the joints. All the micro properties M1, M2, 3 have in common is that they are involved in experiences which we can't tell apart. And so shade of red, then shades of red, shades of colors then are not natural kinds. To the extent that physicalism is a search for the kinds of things that fit into a naturalistic picture of the world, this constitutes an objection. And usually, color physicalism is put forward as a kind of ironic program, right? They'll say, well, yeah, they want to admit colors in the world, but will admit them in only as microphysical properties of some sort. So this would be the conclusion that there really aren't any colors. And we're back to the sort of self-undermining position of Galileo. Well, this leads to an alternative form of physicalism. That is, that colors are the surface reflectance properties of objects. This is a 2 on that list, I'm not mistaken. A surface reflectance property, or maybe it's 3, I forget, I haven't listed in front, is a dispositional property. It's the disposition to absorb some wavelengths and to reflect others. Many very different micro-properties of surfaces may share the same disposition to reflect and absorb light. The same pattern of absorbance reflection. So so all of these may share the same dispositional property. Call that E1. So can we then make this identification under reflectance physicalism? R1 equals D1. Can we say, well, you know, this particular shade of red is a particular dispositional property. You know, we have no problem with dispositional properties being multiply realized, do we? I mean, you know, you can have an ice sculpture which is fragile, and you can have a Ming vase which is fragile, and they both have the same and they both have the same degree of fragility, right? So they have the same dispositional property, even though the physical realizer is completely different in each case. So however, there is a problem with reflectance physicalism. First of all, there is the phenomenon known as metamers, which are different reflectance properties which yield color experiences we can't tell apart. So then we haven't eliminated the disjunctive property. Then R1 becomes D1 or D2 or D3 and so on. So surface reflectance properties as dispositional properties won't be natural times either. The second problem with these dispositions, with these kind of metameric disjunctive properties, we could say instead that instead of yielding the same color experience, we could simply deny the disjunctiveness. We could say that all of these dispositional properties produce different color experiences, but they are color experiences that we can't tell apart. So on this account then, R1 equals D1, R1 equals D2, R1 3 equals D2 equals D3, and so on. In other words, now sometimes when we say we can't tell two shades apart, what it means is that our discrimination is not fine enough. Here what we mean is they are, no matter how finely we discriminate these two shades, they are still going to be different experiences because they are produced by the different dispositional properties. These are all different shades of red, but they are different shades of red which produce the same experiences in us. That is, there are different colors which we cannot distinguish. Unlike the visual cases of color indistinguishability, this does not arise from any limit on our visual acuteness. No matter how good our ability to discriminate colors is, we still could not tell these colors apart. They are genuinely different colors which are indistinguishable in principle. Which shade of red are you seeing now? You really would never know. This would certainly solve the disjunctiveness regarding properties, but only at a price of introducing it into the disjunctiveness into our color experiences themselves. This would constitute a major revision in our ordinary concept of color. we could not, strictly speaking, have the concept of a given shade of red at all. There would be no such thing as a given shade of red. Or we could only have the concept of a kind of shade of red, not a concept of that shade of red. But this concept of a kind of shade of red is not a concept of a range of colors because there's no range. But usually our concept of a kind of entity gives us a capacity for distinguishing among members of our kind, members of that kind. Our concept of a giraffe, for instance, gives us the capacity to distinguish among giraffes. The view that each physical property is a different but indiscriminable color is like having a concept of a kind, but having no concept of the individuals falling under that kind. Our color concepts on this view would be like having a concept of giraffe that gives no capacity for having a thought about one giraffe rather than another. It's not clear that, in fact, this is a concept of a giraffe at all. It seems to be a major conceptual revision in our concept of color, but you only have an explanation when our concept of what is being explained, you only have an explanation when our concept of what is being explained remains constant. So this seems to be, this kind of reflectance, this dispositional reflectance physicalism just seems to be a failed project.